I died exactly as I lived, stressed out, underpaid, and buried beneath a mountain of organza. In my previous life, I was an elite event planner, and my heart gave out during a particularly vicious Bridezilla's 48-hour rehearsal marathon. So you can imagine my sheer, unadulterated annoyance when I opened my eyes to find myself reincarnated not as a pampered princess, but as a dusting maid in the sprawling, obscenely wealthy Harrington estate. Life as a maid wasn't glamorous, but the Duke of Harrington was a remarkably kind employer. He paid well, never yelled, and had a smile that crinkled at the edges. A smile he rarely used since his first wife died 11 years ago. The entire staff worshipped him. We wanted him to be happy. We wanted him to find love again. What we didn't want was Lady Serafina. Serafina was a viper wrapped in expensive silk. Within a week of moving into the estate, she had fired the head chef for a lukewarm soup, kicked the stable boy's dog, and secretly drafted boarding school enrollment papers for the Duke's 3 younger children. Worse, while dusting her study, I found ledgers proving she was embezzling from the Duke's charity foundations to pay off her own family's massive gambling debts. She didn't love the Duke. She was staging a hostile takeover. I couldn't just stand by with my feather duster and watch it happen. My opportunity for treason arrived 3 weeks before the wedding. I was in the grand ballroom, meticulously glaring at a hideous ice sculpture Serafina had ordered, when a voice like dark velvet broke the silence. If you stare at it any harder, it might melt on its own. I spun around to find Lord Julian, the Duke's eldest son and heir. At 24, Julian possessed his father's striking features, his late mother's piercing emerald eyes, and a permanent, cynical scowl. He was notoriously cold, fiercely protective of his younger siblings, and entirely aware of Serafina's true nature. "It's an offense to aesthetics, my lord," I replied, refusing to lower my gaze. "Much like the bride." Julian froze. A maid speaking out of turn was grounds for immediate dismissal, but instead of calling the guards, a slow, wicked smirk spread across his face. He stepped closer, the scent of bergamot and old books washing over me. "You don't like my future stepmother, Ilara?" he murmured, leaning against the pedestal. "I think she's a parasite, my lord," I said frankly. "And if this wedding happens, this family is doomed." Julian's eyes darkened, the humor vanishing, replaced by a dangerous, serious glint. "My father is blinded by loneliness. He won't listen to reason. He needs a spectacle. A disaster so undeniable he cannot ignore it." He looked down at me, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. "Are you brave enough to help me ruin a wedding?" I smiled, feeling the ghost of my past life's event planning clipboard in my hand. "My lord, I was born for it." Chapter 1. Rule 1 of Elite Event Planning. A seating chart is not merely a map of chairs. It is a delicate ecosystem. Placed correctly, mortal enemies can share a breadbasket. Placed incorrectly, you get a bloodbath before the salad course. I was aiming for the bloodbath. The Harrington estate was deathly quiet at midnight. I slipped through the servant corridors, my soft-soled shoes making absolutely no sound against the polished mahogany floorboards. Waiting for me in the shadowed alcove just outside Lady Serafina's private study was Lord Julian. He was dressed entirely in dark clothes, looking less like a duke's noble heir, and more like a devastatingly handsome phantom. "You're late," he murmured, his piercing emerald eyes catching the faint moonlight filtering through the grand window. I had to dodge Mrs. Higgins. "The head housekeeper has the sonar of a bat," I whispered back, pulling a ring of heavy brass keys from my apron pocket. I'd borrowed them from the pantry while preparing the midnight tea trays. Julian took the keys from me, his fingers brushing mine in the dark. The brief, sudden contact sent a totally unhelpful flutter through my stomach. "Focus, Ilara," I chided myself. "We are here for corporate sabotage, not to swoon over the boss's son." With a soft, muffled click, Julian unlocked the heavy oak door. We slipped inside, and the scent of Serafina's cloying, overpowering rose perfume immediately assaulted my senses. Julian struck a match, lighting a single, squat candle on the massive mahogany desk. There, spread out like a general's battle map, was the seating chart for the royal reception. "All right," I said, rubbing my hands together with glee. "Show me the VIPs." Julian leaned over the parchment, his shoulder brushing mine. "The high table is here. She has her disgraced uncle sitting right next to the Minister of Finance. Subtle." He scoffed, his disdain palpable. But if you want maximum collateral damage, you need to look at table 4. I scanned the elegantly scripted names. Lord Vance and the Earl of Sussex. Vance is a staunch traditionalist who thinks the sky is falling if a woman speaks out of turn. The Duchess of Moray, however. Julian's lips quirked into a genuinely wicked smile. She is currently involved in a highly public, scandalous affair with a playwright. She breeds hunting hounds, and she drinks grown men under the table. Serafina deliberately put them on opposite sides of the ballroom to keep the peace. Not anymore, I said, uncapping a sharp quill. With precise, forged strokes, a skill I'd heavily honed faking vendor signatures in my past life, I meticulously swapped their names. I'll seat them shoulder to shoulder. Vance will inevitably insult her honor by the soup course, and she will likely throw her wine in his face before the entrees. Julian let out a low, rough chuckle that did absolutely zero to help my racing pulse. You are genuinely terrifying, Alara. I am merely dedicated to my craft, my lord. We worked in perfect tandem for the next 20 minutes, systematically turning Serafina's meticulously planned social harmony into a ticking time bomb. It was strangely, dangerously intimate, huddled together in the dim, flickering candlelight. The quiet scratch of the quill, the rustle of heavy parchment, the rhythmic rise and fall of Julian's chest right beside me. I reached across the desk to adjust the placement of the Archbishop, but Julian reached for the exact same nameplate. His large, warm hand clamped directly over mine. Neither of us pulled away. The air in the study suddenly felt incredibly thick. I slowly looked up, my gaze traveling up his dark sleeve, past his broad shoulders, until I met his eyes. The cynical, guarded scowl he usually wore was completely gone, replaced by an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. His thumb shifted, gently tracing the knuckles of my ink-stained hand. A jolt of pure electricity shot up my arm, completely overriding my reincarnated Maid survival instincts. He leaned down, his face coming so close to mine I could smell the faint trace of bergamot and dark tea on his skin. His gaze dropped to my lips. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. Alara, he whispered, his voice a gravelly, magnetic murmur. Before I could even think of a response, the heavy brass doorknob violently rattled. We both froze. A heavy, mailed fist pounded against the thick oak wood, the sound exploding like a cannon shot in the quiet room. Lady Serafina, are you in there? A gruff, impatient voice barked. Julian's eyes widened in sheer horror. It was the captain of the Duke's Guard. I saw the light under the door, the captain continued, his voice muffled but unmistakable. I'm coming in. The lock clicked, and the heavy oak door began to swing open. The bright light from the hallway spilling directly toward the desk where we stood, hopelessly trapped. Chapter 2. Rule 2 of Elite Event Planning. A bridal gown is structural engineering disguised as fashion. It must withstand dancing, sitting, and the sheer ego of the bride. Compromise the foundation, and the whole temple collapses. In the fraction of a second before the study door swung fully open, Julian moved with terrifying reflexes. He pinched the candle wick between his bare fingers, plunging us into total darkness, wrapped a strong arm around my waist, and yanked me backward. We stumbled behind the heavy velvet drapes just as the captain's lantern beam swept across the room. I held my breath, my face smashed against Julian's chest, listening to the thunderous beating of his heart. Must have been the draft from the window, the captain muttered to himself. The door clicked shut, and the lock turned. Julian exhaled a shaky breath against my hair. That was entirely too close. Speak for yourself, I wheezed, stepping out of his grip. If I get fired, I lose my dental plan. There was no time to dwell on almost getting caught, or almost getting kissed. The next afternoon, the most critical piece of the wedding arrived. The dress. Serafina had imported it from the capital. A monstrous, glittering confection of ivory silk, excessive lace, and enough pearls to sink a small battleship. It was currently sitting on a mannequin in her private dressing room, guarded like state secrets. I need exactly 4 minutes, I told Julian as we hid in the servants' stairwell. 4 minutes, he agreed, adjusting his immaculate cravat. Leave the guards to me. Julian strode out into the main corridor with the righteous fury only a nobleman could weaponize. I watched through the crack in the door as he approached the 2 hulking guards stationed outside the dressing room. You there? Julian barked, his voice echoing with absolute authority. Who authorized the carriage parking arrangement in the lower courtyard? Are you intentionally trying to break the legs of my father's prize stallions on those uneven cobblestones?" The guards stammered, abandoning their posts to follow the furious heir to the nearest window to inspect the courtyard. It was the perfect distraction. I slipped into the dressing room, locking the door softly behind me. Pulling my trusty, razor-sharp seam ripper from my apron, I approached the monstrosity. I wasn't going to shred it, that would be obvious vandalism, and she'd just buy another one. No, I was going to employ structural sabotage. I found the crucial load-bearing seams at the waistline, and right down the center of the back. Snip, snip, snip. I worked with the precision of a surgeon, loosening the heavy silk threads just enough. The dress would hold together beautifully while she stood still, but the moment she tried to kneel at the altar or take a deep breath to say "I do," catastrophic wardrobe malfunction. I had just tucked the seam ripper away when the brass handle of the door rattled. Panic. Had the guards returned early? The door unlocked with a click, and a tall figure slipped inside, shutting it quickly. I raised my feather duster like a weapon, only to lower it when I saw Julian leaning against the wood, breathing hard. "A secondary patrol," he whispered urgently, coming up the east stairs. "They saw me in the corridor. We need to hide." He grabbed my hand and pulled us both into the massive, cedar-lined walk-in wardrobe, pulling the slatted door shut just as heavy footsteps entered the dressing room outside. The closet was incredibly cramped, filled with Seraphina's endless winter cloaks. We were forced flush against each other, completely surrounded by fur and darkness. My back was pressed to the cedar wall, and Julian was caged in front of me, his hands resting on the wood on either side of my head to keep from crushing me. "Are you stalking me, my lord?" I whispered, aiming for sarcastic but landing somewhere near breathless. "Protecting my investment, Alara," he murmured back. The confined space amplified the deep timbre of his voice. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Every time he inhaled, his chest brushed against mine. The suffocating tension from the night before flooded back, 10 times stronger in the dark. Julian looked down at me, his emerald eyes dark and heavy. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head, completely erasing the remaining space between us. My eyes fluttered shut. And then, a shrill, blood-curdling scream echoed from the hallway right outside our closet door. Chapter 3. Rule 3 of Elite Event Planning. A wedding toast is the emotional climax of a reception. The champagne must be absolutely flawless, because if the beverage is bitter, the sentiment instantly turns sour. Literally. My mother's pearl-handled hairbrush. Who moved it? The screech vibrating through the cedar closet wasn't a murder in progress. It was just Lady Seraphina having a meltdown of epic proportions in the adjacent suite. The secondary patrol hurried past our hiding spot to soothe the tyrant, leaving the dressing room completely empty. Julian let out a long, ragged exhale, his forehead dropping to rest against the wooden door just inches from my face. "I am going to age prematurely if we keep doing this," he muttered, though the ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Think of it as character building, my lord," I whispered, slipping past him and out of the closet before my dangerously elevated heart rate could give me a heart attack in this life too. Our next target required a descent into the Harrington Estate's subterranean wine cellars. The Duke had spared absolutely no expense for the reception, procuring a single, heavily guarded crate of rare, century-old champagne from the royal vineyards. It cost more gold coins than I would make in a lifetime of dusting. The cellar was cool, damp, and lit only by the flickering glow of a single lantern we had smuggled down. Julian had expertly bypassed the heavy iron padlock, and now we stood over the wooden crate, surrounded by towering oak casks. "It almost feels like a crime to ruin a vintage this magnificent," Julian noted, holding up a dusty dark green bottle. "We aren't ruining it," I corrected, pulling a large glass funnel and a jug of my secret weapon from my apron. "We are simply relocating it to that empty ale barrel over there for safekeeping. What we are serving the bride, however, is a different story." I uncorked the jug. The sharp, acrid stench of heavily fermented apple vinegar instantly flooded the damp air. Julian wrinkled his aristocratic nose in disgust, but a wicked gleam lit up his emerald eyes. Working together, we painstakingly decanted the priceless champagne into the barrel and replaced it with the harsh vinegar, using a mallet to gently tap the vintage corks back into place. The absurdity of it all. A highborn heir and a lowly maid, huddled in the dirt, sabotaging thousands of gold coins worth of wine, suddenly hit me. I let out a soft snort of laughter. Julian looked up, an amused eyebrow raised, and then he started laughing too. It was a rich, genuine sound that completely transformed his brooding face, making him look breathtakingly carefree. We were intoxicated not by the wine, but by the sheer, adrenaline-fueled rebellion of it all. "You are a menace, Ilara," he chuckled, wiping a stray drop of vinegar from the neck of the final bottle. He looked at me across the crate, the laughter fading into something much softer, much more intense. "But I think I'm beginning to entirely depend on you." He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a smudge of cellar dust from my cheek. Before I could lean into his touch, the heavy iron hinges of the main cellar door groaned loudly above us. We both froze. Heavy boots and the sharp click-clack of heels began to descend the stone steps. "I simply must toast with you now, my darling," the Duke's warm, baritone voice echoed down the stairwell. "Oh, you spoil me, your grace," Serafina simpered, her voice dripping with fake, sugary sweetness. Julian's hand dropped from my face. We scrambled backward, flattening ourselves into the narrow, shadowed gap between two massive oak casks just as the Duke's lantern light pierced the gloom. "The cellar master said the royal crate was left right here," the Duke murmured, stepping up to the exact crate we had just tampered with. He reached down, his fingers wrapping around the neck of the bottle Julian had sealed mere seconds ago. "Let us open one of the vintage bottles right here, my love. A taste of our future." Chapter 4. Rule 4 of Elite Event Planning. The rings are the only physical manifestation of eternal love at a wedding. Naturally, they are the easiest things to completely lose track of. Pressed flush against the damp oak casks, I watched the Duke expertly pry the cork from the vintage bottle. It popped with a cheerful thwack that echoed in the cavernous cellar. "To us, my beautiful bride," the Duke declared affectionately, pouring the liquid into two crystal flutes he'd brought down on a silver tray. Serafina batted her eyelashes, taking the glass with a practiced, delicate grace. "To our eternal devotion, your grace." They clinked their glasses. They simultaneously took a sip. What followed was a masterpiece of aristocratic indignity. Serafina's eyes bugged out of her skull. With a thoroughly unladylike gag, she spat the fermented apple vinegar entirely across the aisle, directly onto the Duke's pristine white cravat. "Poison!" Serafina shrieked, violently hurling the crystal flute to the stone floor where it shattered into 100 pieces. She began furiously wiping her tongue with the back of her hand. "The incompetent cellar master is trying to assassinate me. Guards! Guards!" The Duke, dripping with sharp-smelling vinegar and looking utterly bewildered, began frantically trying to soothe her. The sheer volume of her screeching brought two guards jogging down the stairs. In the ensuing pandemonium of accusations and shattered glass, Julian grabbed my wrist, and we melted into the shadows, slipping past them and up the back servant stairs like ghosts. "Next target," Julian whispered, his eyes dancing with adrenaline as we reached the ground floor. The rings. The Harrington family vault was located in the east wing, guarded by two heavily armored sentries. This required finesse. As the heir, Julian had clearance. As a maid, my presence would be highly suspicious. "Wait around the corner," Julian instructed, adjusting his lapels to resume his haughty nobleman persona. "When I cough, make a scene." I scurried behind a marble pillar, gripping a heavy silver tray laden with polishing supplies. Peeking around the edge, I watched Julian march up to the vault doors. "Open it," he commanded the sentries lazily. "My father requested I inspect the ceremonial platinum bands. He fears the jeweler allowed them to tarnish." The guards exchanged a hesitant look, but didn't dare question the Duke's son. With a heavy groan of metal, the vault door swung open. Julian stepped inside, standing by the velvet display case. A moment later, he let out a loud, distinct cough. I took a deep breath, stepped out from behind the pillar, and violently hurled my silver tray down the stone corridor. The noise was deafening. Both guards instantly whirled around, hands resting on the hilts of their swords, distracted by the chaotic sight of a maid frantically chasing rolling silver-polished tins across the floor. In that brief 3-second window, Julian slipped the platinum wedding bands into his waistcoat pocket and calmly walked out of the vault. "Pardon the noise, my lord," I squeaked, bowing my head as he passed me. "Clumsy staff," Julian muttered loudly for the guard's benefit, though he shot me a brilliant, conspiratorial wink. We reconvened in the safety of the dusty, sunlit library, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind us. The adrenaline of the heist left me breathless. Julian pulled the glittering platinum rings from his pocket, tossing them lightly in the palm of his hand before setting them on a high bookshelf, completely out of sight. He turned back to me, the distance between us vanishing in 2 long strides. "We make a remarkably good team, Ilara," he said softly, his voice dropping an octave. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch sent a warm shiver straight down my spine. I don't think I've felt this alive in years. I looked up into his emerald eyes, completely losing my train of thought. Bam. The library doors violently shuddered as someone kicked them open, splintering the lock we'd just secured. Serafina burst into the room, her face flushed with absolute fury, flanked by 3 royal guards with their hands on their weapons. She marched straight toward us, pointing a long, manicured finger directly at Julian's chest. "Search him," she screeched, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "My priceless diamond necklace is missing from my vanity, and I demand his pockets be emptied this instant." Chapter 5. Rule 5 of Elite Event Planning. Florals dictate the atmosphere of the entire venue. A well-placed bloom can evoke sweeping romance, but the wrong pollen can turn a dignified ceremony into a biological hazard zone. Julian didn't even flinch. He didn't check his pockets, nor did he step away from me. Instead, he slowly drew himself up to his full, intimidating height, looking down his aristocratic nose at the 3 guards with a stare so icy it could have frozen the harbor. "You intend to search the heir to the Dukedom of Harrington?" Julian asked, his voice lethally quiet. "On the baseless, hysterical accusation of a woman who is not yet part of this family?" The guards hesitated, their hands nervously dropping from their hilts. "If any of you lay a single finger on my person," Julian continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward them, "I will have you stripped of your ranks, court-martialed for treason against the bloodline, and exiled to the salt mines before the sun sets. Are we clear?" The guards immediately bowed their heads and took 2 massive steps back, utterly terrified. Serafina's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. She opened her mouth to screech again, but Julian simply pointed toward the splintered doors. "Get out of my library, Lady Serafina, before I ask my father why you are fabricating crimes to turn him against his own son." Fuming, completely outplayed, Serafina let out a sound like a boiling kettle and stormed out, her guards scrambling after her. As soon as they were gone, Julian sagged slightly, letting out a heavy breath. "I truly despise that woman. Come on. We need to move before she actually finds her necklace." Our next target was the grand glasshouse on the southern lawns. The air inside the glasshouse was thick, heavy, and suffocatingly humid. The scent of the lilies was already headache-inducing. "All right, poisoner," Julian murmured, shutting the glass door behind us. "What is the play here?" "Biological warfare," I replied, pulling 2 small, corked vials from my apron. As a maid, I tend the herb gardens. I spent the morning extracting a highly potent sneezing agent from pepper blooms and mixing it with dried, pulverized itchweed. Using a tiny, fine-bristled brush, I began meticulously dusting the sticky yellow stamens of the lilies with the invisible powder. Anyone standing near the altar, namely the bride and the priest, would be completely incapacitated within minutes. We worked quickly, but the humid, oppressive heat of the greenhouse was rapidly catching up to us. My skin was flushed, and damp strands of hair stuck to my forehead. Julian, clearly feeling the heat as well, shrugged off his heavy velvet jacket and tossed it onto a nearby potting bench. He reached up, untying his cravat and tossing it aside before methodically rolling up the sleeves of his linen shirt to his elbows. I paused mid-brushstroke. I was a professional event planner, not a nun. And Julian Harrington, with his hair slightly tousled, his collar open, and his surprisingly toned forearms flexing as he handled the heavy terracotta pots, was an absolute, devastating distraction. "You're staring, Ilara," he teased, his voice a low, knowing rumble that vibrated right through the humid air. I snapped my gaze back to the lilies, my cheeks burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the greenhouse. "I am merely ensuring you don't accidentally dust yourself with itchweed, my lord." "Liar," he murmured softly. He closed the distance between us, his chest brushing against my shoulder as he reached past me to adjust a flower stem. He didn't pull away. He turned his head, his face inches from mine, his emerald eyes heavy with the same magnetic tension we'd been battling for days. "Ilara," he whispered, lifting a hand to cup my flushed cheek. Clank. The sharp, heavy sound of metal striking metal echoed through the glass walls. shattering the moment entirely. Julian and I whipped around in horror. Through the condensation-streaked glass, we saw the hulking silhouette of Serafina's personal, hand-picked bodyguard walking away. Hanging from the iron handle of the greenhouse's only exit was a massive, heavy-duty padlock. We were locked in. Chapter 6. Rule 6 of Elite Event Planning. Unplanned venue lockdowns are a logistical nightmare. When confined to a small space under high-stress conditions, repressed emotions will inevitably boil over. Always locate the emergency exit before feelings get involved. Julian threw his shoulder against the iron-wrought frame of the glass door. The heavy glass rattled, but the thick iron padlock held completely firm. He let out a frustrated guttural curse, dragging a hand through his dark, tousled hair. "It's no use," he muttered, pacing the narrow gravel path between the massive terracotta pots. "The glass is reinforced to withstand winter hail, and the metal framing is solid. We are effectively caged." As the sun rapidly dipped below the horizon, the oppressive, suffocating heat of the greenhouse gave way to a creeping damp chill. The vibrant colors of the poisoned lilies bled away, replaced by the silvery, muted tones of moonlight filtering through the glass roof. With the darkness came a stark shift in the atmosphere. The thrilling, adrenaline-fueled humor of our sabotage completely faded, leaving behind the heavy, quiet reality of our situation. Julian sank onto a weathered stone bench, his elbows resting heavily on his knees. The arrogant, untouchable air was gone, replaced by a weary young man carrying an immense burden. I sat beside him, carefully maintaining a respectful distance, though the silence stretched until it was almost painful. "When my mother died," Julian's voice suddenly broke the quiet, startling me. It was raw, completely stripped of all its usual cynical armor. It broke him. Completely. For years, he was just a ghost wandering these halls. He stopped writing, stopped reading, stopped seeing us. He turned his head, his emerald eyes catching the moonlight, reflecting a profound, deeply buried sorrow. We eventually got him back in pieces, but he has always been absolutely terrified of being alone again. Serafina saw that vulnerability and sank her claws right into it. "I won't let her take my family, Alara," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "I won't let her destroy whatever is left of the man who raised me." My heart ached for him. Without overthinking the boundaries of our stations, I closed the distance between us on the stone bench and reached out, gently wrapping my hand over his. His fingers were cold, and he instantly intertwined them with mine, holding on tightly as if I were a lifeline. The air between us shifted again, losing the conspiratorial edge, and becoming intensely, overwhelmingly intimate. Julian shifted closer, his gaze dropping to my lips. His free hand reached up, his fingers sliding into the damp hair at the nape of my neck, tilting my face up toward his. "You are the only good thing to happen to this estate in a very long time," he murmured, his breath warming my chilled skin. There were no guards to distract us. There were no screeching brides to interrupt. There was nothing left between us but the quiet moonlight. I leaned in, my eyelids fluttering shut as his lips hovered a bare millimeter from mine. Suddenly, a blinding flash of brilliant orange light exploded against the glass roof, illuminating the entire greenhouse like brutal daylight. We sprang apart just as a deafening, thunderous roar shattered the quiet night. We rushed to the glass wall, staring in sheer horror as a massive pillar of fire erupted from the estate's west wing, sending a violent plume of black smoke billowing into the starry sky. Chapter 7. Rule 7 of Elite Event Planning. Every reputable venue must have an ironclad emergency evacuation protocol. When a sudden disaster strikes, the absolute priority is saving lives. But when dealing with a hostile corporate takeover, saving the receipts is a very close second. The West Wing. Julian yelled over the distant roar of the flames, his face pale in the orange light. "Alara, the West Wing is where my father keeps the estate's financial archives." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The auditors from the capital were due to arrive next week to review the Duke's charities. Serafina wasn't just throwing a tantrum. She had ordered her cronies to burn the evidence of her massive embezzlement. "Stand back," Julian ordered. He sprinted toward a heavy iron shovel resting near a pile of potting soil. He swung it like a battle axe, driving the heavy metal head directly into the center of the reinforced glass pane. It fractured with a spiderweb of cracks. He swung again, and the glass completely shattered, raining sharp fragments onto the gravel. We scrambled through the jagged opening, tearing across the dark lawns toward the blazing manor. The courtyard was absolute pandemonium. Servants were running in circles. Guards were shouting useless orders, and the heat radiating from the stone walls was already blistering. Julian instantly transformed into the commanding lord he was born to be. He vaulted onto the edge of the stone fountain, his voice slicing through the panic with terrifying authority. "Listen to me," he roared. "Guards, clear the perimeter. Higgins, get the younger children out of the east wing immediately. The rest of you, form a bucket brigade from the fountain to the courtyard doors. Move." The staff instantly snapped to attention, rallied by his sheer presence. But as Julian leaped down to help heave the first heavy wooden bucket of water, I looked up at the second-floor window of the archive room. The flames hadn't fully breached it yet, but the smoke was thickening. If those ledgers burned, Serafina would win. She would marry the Duke, drain his wealth, and exile Julian and his siblings. I couldn't let that happen. I grabbed a linen napkin from a discarded tray, plunged it into a water bucket, and tied it tightly around my nose and mouth. Before Julian could see me, I sprinted away from the safety of the courtyard and plunged directly into the smoking, chaotic corridor of the West Wing. The heat inside was suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on my lungs. The air was thick with blinding, acrid black smoke. I stayed low, crawling up the grand staircase as the ornate wallpaper blistered and peeled away from the walls around me. "Come on, Ilera." I coughed into my wet rag. "You survived the Bridezilla of 2019. You can survive a little structural fire." I reached the heavy mahogany door of the archive room. It was locked. Taking a few steps back, I channeled every ounce of pent-up rage I held toward Serafina, the patriarchy, and my terrible past life salary, and kicked the door with all my might. The wood splintered around the lock, and the door flew open. The room was filling with smoke, but the flames were still chewing through the ceiling above. I dropped to my knees, crawling toward the heavy iron fireproof lockbox bolted beneath the desk. It was secured with a massive padlock. I desperately scanned the room, my eyes watering violently. Beside the hearth sat a heavy, solid brass fireplace poker. I grabbed it, raised it high, and brought it down on the padlock with a resounding crack. I hit it again, and again. On the fourth strike, the metal shattered. I ripped the lockbox open. There, sitting perfectly untouched beneath a layer of dust, were the damning, handwritten ledgers detailing Serafina's theft. I shoved the heavy, leather-bound books deep into my apron, hugging them tightly to my chest. "Got you," I wheezed. I turned back toward the doorway, desperate for oxygen, ready to run back to Julian. But I stopped dead in my tracks. The doorway was no longer empty. Standing amid the swirling black smoke, blocking the only exit, was a tall, menacing silhouette. And in the flickering orange light of the approaching fire, I saw the undeniable, lethal gleam of a drawn steel blade. Chapter 8. Rule 8 of Elite Event Planning. A true bridezilla does not merely threaten to ruin your day. She will actively try to end your life. When the veil comes off and the claws come out, standard de-escalation tactics no longer apply. Run. The silhouette stepped forward into the flickering, violent light of the flames. It was Serafina. Her usually immaculate hair was wild, and soot streaked her aristocratic features, twisting her beautiful face into a terrifying, murderous sneer. In her manicured hand, she held a long, gleaming stiletto dagger. "I knew it," Serafina hissed, her voice vibrating with pure malice. "I knew that arrogant brat Julian was up to something, but I never imagined he'd enlist a filthy, nosy little rat to do his dirty work. I prefer Elite Event Coordinator, actually." I coughed into my wet rag, clutching the heavy ledgers tighter to my chest. I tightened my grip on the brass fireplace poker, but my arms were trembling from the lack of oxygen. "Hand over the books, Maid," she commanded, taking a slow, predatory step forward. "The fire is going to consume this entire wing. The ledgers will burn, and you will burn right along with them. Unless you want me to bleed you first." "Over my dead body," I croaked. "That is exactly the itinerary." Serafina lunged. She moved with terrifying, unladylike speed. I swung the brass poker, but my smoke-filled lungs betrayed me. I stumbled, and the heavy metal swung wide. Serafina dodged it effortlessly and delivered a vicious, ringing backhand across my face. The force of the blow sent me sprawling to the floorboards. The wind was knocked out of me, and the heavy leather ledgers tumbled from my grasp, skidding across the floor directly to Serafina's feet. "Thank you," she mocked, scooping up the damning evidence. Before I could scramble away, she grabbed a fistful of my hair, yanking me upward with shocking strength. But I can't just leave you here. Someone might find your roasted little corpse before it's thoroughly unrecognizable. And I simply cannot have a murder investigation ruining my honeymoon. Pressing the sharp point of the stiletto directly against my spine, she forced me out of the burning archives and dragged me down a hidden, narrow servant's stairwell that plunged deep into the bowels of the estate. Away from the shouting guards, away from the bucket brigade, and away from Julian. We descended past the main wine cellar, down to the lowest subterranean level, a damp, forgotten storage vault with a heavy, rusted iron door. Serafina violently shoved me inside. I crashed onto the cold, hard stone floor, my ribs aching. "Enjoy the wedding from down here," she laughed cruelly, her silhouette framed in the doorway. "Try not to miss me too much." Slam. The massive iron door swung shut, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. The heavy scrape of a rusted bar falling into place echoed from the other side. I scrambled to my feet, throwing my weight against the iron. "Hey, let me out!" I screamed, pounding my fists until my knuckles bled. But I was too deep underground. The thick stone walls swallowed my voice entirely. Hours passed in the freezing dark. The adrenaline wore off, leaving me shivering, bruised, and utterly defeated. I slid down the wall, pulling my knees to my chest. Julian didn't know where I was. Serafina had the ledgers. She was going to win. Then a heavy, muffled sound vibrated through the stone ceiling above me. Bong! 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 The great bells of the cathedral. The wedding was starting. A fresh wave of despair washed over me, but it was immediately interrupted by a terrifying, structural groan echoing in the dark. The heat from the fire above, combined with the sudden influx of thousands of gallons of water from the bucket brigade, had compromised the ancient plumbing of the West Wing. With a violent, metallic shriek, a massive main pipe running directly through the cellar ceiling violently ruptured. Freezing, murky water exploded into the pitch-black room, hitting the floor with the force of a waterfall. The water level began to rise instantly, swirling around my ankles, then my knees, filling the sealed iron vault with terrifying speed. Chapter 9. Rule 9 of Elite Event Planning. Venue plumbing is historically temperamental. A burst pipe can easily ruin a reception, but if the event planner drowns before the appetizers are served, the deposit is completely non-refundable. The water was up to my waist and rising with terrifying, unyielding speed. The pitch-black subterranean vault had transformed into a freezing, swirling whirlpool. The sound of the rushing water was deafening, echoing off the stone walls and drowning out my frantic screams for help. I waded blindly through the dark, my hands desperately feeling along the walls until my fingers bumped into the rough wood of an empty, floating storage barrel. I hauled myself up onto it, shivering violently as the freezing water soaked through my uniform. But the barrel was unstable, bobbing erratically under my weight. Within minutes, the water level reached my chest. The ceiling was only a few feet away. I tilted my head back, gasping for the dwindling pockets of breathable air, the bitter cold seeping into my bones and slowing my racing heart. So this is it, I thought dimly, my grip on the barrel slipping. Reincarnated just to die in a basement while the worst bridezilla in history wins. Just as the murky water lapped against my chin, and I prepared to take my final breath, a massive, deafening clang vibrated through the water. The rusted iron door groaned. Clang. The heavy metal hinges shrieked in protest. On the third strike, the door violently gave way, blown completely off its frame by a concussive blast of sheer, brute force. A beam of yellow lantern light pierced the murky darkness. Standing in the doorway, chest heaving, a massive iron sledgehammer dropping from his blistered hands, was Julian. He was drenched in sweat and dark soot, his linen shirt torn, but his emerald eyes were wide and wild with a panic I had never seen in him before. "Alara!" His voice tore through the cavern, raw and desperate. He didn't hesitate. Julian plunged directly into the freezing, chest-high water, splashing frantically across the flooded vault until he reached me. I slipped from the barrel, my frozen legs failing me, but before I could go under, his strong arms wrapped around my waist, hauling me flush against his chest. He scooped me up effortlessly, holding me so tightly my ribs ached. He buried his face in the crook of my freezing, wet neck, his broad shoulders trembling. I could hear his heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my own. "I thought I lost you," he choked out, his voice cracking entirely. I tore the burning wing apart looking for you. When I found the secret stairwell. God, Ilara, I thought I was too late. Julian. I coughed, my teeth chattering so violently I could barely form the words. I clung to his soaked shirt, resting my heavy head against his shoulder. Serafina. She locked me in. She took the ledgers. She's going to. At the mention of her name, the desperate relief in Julian's eyes instantly vanished, replaced by an absolute, lethal coldness. His jaw set into a hardened line of pure fury. She is not going to do anything, he growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly octave. Without setting me down, he turned and marched us out of the flooded vault, carrying my shivering, soaked form up the stone steps. We emerged into the smoky courtyard just as the great bells of the cathedral began to chime their final, ceremonial toll. Julian, wait, I stammered, realizing what direction he was heading. I'm drenched. I'm freezing. Put me down. Absolutely not. I am never letting you out of my sight again, he declared flatly, his long strides eating up the distance across the manicured lawns. He didn't head for the infirmary. He marched directly toward the towering, stained glass facade of the cathedral, right as the majestic, sweeping chords of the bridal chorus began to echo from within. Chapter 10. Rule 10 of Elite Event Planning. A perfectly timed entrance is the hallmark of professional production. If you must interrupt a ceremony, do it with maximum theatricality, unyielding confidence, and preferably, absolute catastrophe unfolding in the background. Bang! Julian didn't just open the heavy, carved oak doors of the cathedral. He kicked them completely off their interior latches. The deafening sound echoed like a cannon blast, rattling the ancient stained glass windows. The majestic bridal chorus instantly screeched to a halt as the panicked organist slammed his hands onto the wrong keys, producing a horrific, dissonant wail. Every single head in the packed cathedral whipped around to face the entrance. And what a scene they were treated to. Inside, the venue was already a masterpiece of absolute pandemonium. My sabotage had bloomed beautifully. The seating chart disaster from the rehearsal dinner had clearly spilled over into the pews. Lord Vance and the Duchess of Moray's entourages were actively brawling in the third row, using velvet-bound hymnals as projectile weapons. At the altar, the floral fiasco was in glorious, devastating effect. The 6 bridesmaids were completely ignoring the ceremony, furiously clawing at their arms and necks, their faces bright red and miserable from the itchweed. The archbishop was hunched heavily over his golden podium, emitting wet, violent sneezes every 3 seconds. And then there was the bride. Serafina stood rigid at the altar, looking like a furious, overstuffed sausage. The dress disaster had forced her to hastily safety pin the ruptured seams of her ivory silk gown together, meaning she couldn't take a full breath without risking total exposure. Julian. The Duke gasped from the altar, his eyes wide with shock. Ignoring the brawling nobles, the sneezing priest, and the hundreds of staring aristocrats, Julian began a slow, deliberate march straight down the center aisle. He was covered in black soot, his shirt was torn, and he was firmly carrying a soaking wet, shivering, dirt-streaked maid in his arms. The collective gasp from the high society attendees sucked whatever oxygen was left in the massive room. Put her down. Have you lost your mind? Serafina shrieked, her face turning an ugly shade of magenta as we approached the altar steps. This is my wedding day. Guards, remove this filthy servant at once. The guards hesitated, completely unsure of how to handle the furious, soot-covered air. Julian ignored her entirely. He reached the foot of the altar and finally, gently, set me down on my feet. I swayed slightly, my frozen legs trembling, but Julian immediately wrapped a strong, protective arm around my waist, anchoring me firmly to his side. He glared up at Serafina with a look of such absolute, lethal disgust that she actually took a step back. Please, the archbishop wheezed, wiping his streaming eyes with his golden stole. He was desperate to escape the poison lilies. Let us just finish. The rings. For the love of the heavens, just give me the rings. The Duke, looking utterly bewildered by his son's appearance, patted his pockets nervously. Yes, Julian, the rings. The vault. Ah yes. The rings, Julian interrupted, his voice ringing out cold and clear, easily carrying over the gasps and the sneezes. He reached into his soaked, soot-stained waistcoat pocket. With a slow, dramatic flourish, he raised his hand high into the air for the entire congregation to see. But instead of glittering, priceless platinum bands, Dangling from Julian's soot-stained fingers were two massive, heavily rusted iron washers we'd stolen from the cellar plumbing. Chapter 11. Rule 11 of Elite Event Planning. A public scandal is like a runaway train. Once it starts, you don't try to stop it. You just make sure you're in the front row with a clear view of the wreckage. There will be no rings. Julian's voice boomed, slicing through the chaotic murmurs of the cathedral like a hot blade through silk. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the Duchess of Moray stopped mid-swing with her hymnal. Every eye was locked on the two rusted iron washers Julian held aloft. Seraphina's face went from magenta to a ghostly, sickly white. "Julian, you insolent brat," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Your Grace, he has clearly succumbed to the stress of the fire. He's trying to humiliate us." The Duke stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached toward his son. "Julian, what is the meaning of this? Why would you bring the maid here? Why are you?" "Because the woman you are about to marry is a criminal, father," Julian interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. He turned to me, his emerald eyes softening for a fraction of a second as he squeezed my waist. Then he reached into the inner lining of his wet coat. He didn't pull out the rusted washers this time. He pulled out a stack of leather-bound, partially singed papers. Seraphina's eyes bugged out. She instinctively reached for the bodice of her dress, the place where she had hidden the ledgers she stole from me in the cellar. I saw the realization hit her. In the struggle to drag me down the stairs, or perhaps in the frantic rush to the altar, she hadn't noticed Julian's elite-level pickpocketing skills. "The fire didn't destroy everything," Julian declared, throwing the papers at his father's feet. They fanned out across the marble floor, the elegant, damning ink of the real estate ledgers exposed for all to see. "Read them, father. Look at the signatures. Look at the missing thousands from the orphanage fund. Look at the gambling debts she's been paying off with our family's legacy." The Duke, his face pale and hands shaking, knelt and picked up the top ledger. As he scanned the lines, his own forged signature, the diverted funds, the cold, calculated theft, the heartbreak in his eyes was visceral. He looked up at Seraphina as if seeing her for the first time. "Is this true?" he whispered, his voice cracking with a decade of accumulated loneliness. "Seraphina, I gave you everything." "It's a lie," Seraphina shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. She realized the high society mask was shattered. The guests were whispering, pointing, and the Duke was looking at her with nothing but disgust. "That maid, she planted those. She's been seducing Julian to turn him against me. She's a common thief." "The only thing Alara stole was my heart," Julian said firmly, his voice echoing with a conviction that made my breath hitch. "And the only person who tried to kill anyone today was you." The Duke stood up, his posture regaining the ironclad dignity of his title. "Guards," he commanded, his voice cold as the grave. "Take this woman to the dungeons. The wedding is over." The royal guards, no longer hesitant, stepped onto the altar. But Seraphina wasn't finished. With a primal animalistic shriek of pure rage, she realized her life of luxury was evaporating. She reached into the ripped, pinned-together bodice of her wedding dress, and pulled out a hidden, needle-thin stiletto. She didn't go for me. She didn't go for Julian. With a manic glint in her eyes, she lunged directly for the Duke's heart. Chapter 12. Rule 12 of Elite Event Planning. Even the most meticulous schedule will eventually face an unexpected, catastrophic variable. When the bride bypasses the bouquet toss and pulls a concealed weapon, standard vendor contracts are officially null and void. Time seemed to suspend itself in the cavernous, echoing space of the cathedral. I watched, paralyzed by the freezing water still seeping into my bones, as the glinting steel of the stiletto arched toward the Duke's chest. The Duke, completely blindsided by the sudden violence from the woman he thought he loved, didn't even raise his hands to defend himself. But Julian did. Before I could even scream, Julian moved with a terrifying, explosive speed born of pure instinct. He didn't just step in front of his father. He launched himself directly into Seraphina's path. His large hand shot out, clamping around Seraphina's wrist with the force of an iron vice just inches from the Duke's velvet waistcoat. Seraphina shrieked, a wild, feral sound. But Julian's expression was a mask of absolute, lethal calm. He twisted her wrist sharply. The stiletto slipped from her manicured fingers, clattering uselessly against the polished marble steps of the altar. Without missing a beat, Julian swept his heavy boot against the back of her knees, kicking her legs out from under her. Serafina crashed hard onto the floor in a tangled, ruined heap of pinned ivory silk and lace. The royal guards finally snapped out of their paralyzed shock. A half-dozen armored men swarmed the altar, burying the screeching, thrashing bride beneath a mountain of steel and chainmail, firmly pinning her to the ground. "Get your hands off me," Serafina spat, thrashing wildly. "I am the future Duchess of Harrington. I will have you all hanged." But her threats fell on deaf ears.